At Forrester Creations, conflict had always existed beneath the polished surfaces of couture and legacy, but rarely had it felt this raw, this dangerously close to unraveling everything the family claimed to stand for. What began as tension between Electra, Will, and RJ, something that might once have been dismissed as youthful rivalry or romantic jealousy, had evolved into something far more corrosive, something that seeped into boardrooms, design meetings, and private conversations until there was no longer any safe space left untouched by it. The lines between personal and professional, once carefully guarded, were not just blurred but deliberately erased, and at the center of it all stood RJ, a young man who had tried, at least in the beginning, to hold himself together under the weight of expectation, pride, and wounded love. Ridge had seen the warning signs early, though perhaps not clearly enough. As both a father and a leader, he had urged restraint, reminding RJ that whatever was happening in his personal life had no place in the company that bore their family name. It was a principle Ridge believed in deeply, not just for the sake of professionalism, but for the fragile unity that kept their legacy intact. Yet even as he spoke those words, there was an undercurrent of unease he could not quite articulate, a sense that RJ's struggle was not something that could be neatly contained by advice or authority. RJ listened, outwardly respectful, even determined, but inside him something far more volatile had already begun to take shape. RJ's internal conflict was not simple jealousy, though that was how it first appeared. It was something more insidious, rooted in a profound sense of inadequacy that had been quietly growing long before Will entered the picture. Watching Will step into spaces that RJ felt were rightfully his, whether in Electra's affections or within the family dynamic, did not just provoke anger. It threatened RJ's very sense of identity. And the more he tried to suppress that feeling, the more it twisted into something darker, something that fed on every perceived slight, every moment where he felt overlooked or diminished. In contrast, Will seemed to understand RJ's fragility with unsettling clarity, and instead of avoiding it, he used it carefully and deliberately. Will's strategy was not loud or obvious. He did not need to shout or provoke directly. Instead, he positioned himself as calm, controlled, and reasonable, allowing RJ's reactions to speak for themselves. In meetings, in conversations, even in subtle interactions, Will created situations where RJ's temper would be tested, knowing that it would eventually break through the thin layer of control RJ was desperately trying to maintain. And when it did so in ways that were impossible to ignore. RJ's frustration began to manifest physically, first in small, almost dismissible acts, slamming a folder onto a desk, raising his voice just slightly too high, but soon escalating into something far more alarming. The breaking point came not in a single explosive moment, but in a series of increasingly erratic behaviors that culminated in outright destruction. There was something deeply unsettling about watching RJ lose control in the very space that had once defined his aspirations. The design studio, once a place of creativity and ambition, became the stage for his unraveling. Objects were no longer tools, but outlets for his rage, and each shattered piece of glass or broken fixture seemed to echo the fracture within him. To those around him, it was both shocking and tragically revealing, a glimpse into a mind that was no longer governed by reason or restraint. And yet, even in those moments, there were those who chose to interpret his actions through a lens of sympathy rather than alarm, attributing his behavior to stress, to heartbreak, to the pressures of living up to a legacy that few could truly comprehend. But beneath those explanations lay a more uncomfortable truth, one that no one was ready to confront until it was too late. RJ's descent did not stop at anger or destruction. It crossed a line that should never be crossed, a line that transformed him from a troubled young man into something far more dangerous. The night everything changed was not marked by a single moment of madness, but by a series of choices, each one building upon the last, each one pushing him further away from the person he might have been. Alcohol became a catalyst, not a cause, lowering whatever barriers remained and allowing his darkest impulses to surface unchecked. When RJ sought out Electra that night, it was not out of love or reconciliation, but out of a distorted need for control, for validation, for something he could claim as his own in a world that increasingly felt like it was slipping beyond his grasp. What happened between them was not a misunderstanding, not a moment of passion gone wrong, but a violation, an act that stripped away any ambiguity and left only the stark reality of what RJ had become. It was an act that could not be undone, no matter how much time passed or how many justifications were offered. For Electra, the aftermath was defined not just by the trauma of the event itself, but by the weight of what it meant to speak out. Her pain was immediate and undeniable, but so too was the pressure that followed. In a world where reputation and image often took precedence over truth, her decision to come forward was not simply about seeking justice. It was about confronting a system that had already begun to close ranks around the person who had harmed her. Her tears were not just expressions of grief, but declarations of a reality that others seemed reluctant to acknowledge. Ridge's response, perhaps more than anything else, revealed the depth of the conflict at the heart of the situation. As a father, he was faced with the unbearable reality of his son's actions. As a patriarch of a powerful family, he was acutely aware of the consequences those actions could have, not just for RJ, but for everything they had built. His instinct to contain the situation, to plead with Electra not to escalate it, was driven by fear. Fear of scandal, of loss, of the irreversible damage that public exposure could bring. Yet in that plea was also a painful misjudgment, an inability to fully grasp the gravity of what had been done and the necessity of accountability. This moment became the true turning point, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire family dynamic. The question was no longer about rivalry or professional conduct, but about morality, responsibility, and the cost of protecting one's own at the expense of justice. Ridge's request placed Electra in an impossible position, asking her to prioritize the preservation of a legacy over her own truth. It was a request that, whether intended or not, mirrored the very power imbalances that had allowed the situation to unfold in the first place. As the fallout began to spread, the atmosphere within Forrester Creations shifted in ways that could not be easily repaired. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to restore, and every interaction carried the weight of what had happened. For Will, the situation was both a vindication and a burden, confirming his understanding of RJ's instability while also forcing him to confront the consequences of having pushed him to the edge. For others within the family, it became a moment of reckoning, a confrontation with the uncomfortable reality that loyalty and justice do not always align. RJ himself was left at the center of a storm he had created, facing not just the external consequences of his actions, but the internal collapse of whatever self-image he had once held. There was no easy path forward for him, no simple redemption arc that could erase what had been done. His story became one of accountability, of confronting the darkest parts of oneself and the irreversible harm they can cause. And through it all, Electra's voice remained the most important, the most necessary, and the most difficult to hear for those who wish to look away. Her decision to speak, to refuse silence, became the anchor around which the entire narrative turned. It was a reminder that beneath the drama, the rivalry, and the legacy, there are boundaries that must never be crossed, and when they are, the only path forward lies not in denial or concealment, but in truth, no matter how painful it may be. The silence that followed was not the kind that brings relief, but the kind that suffocates, pressing down on every person inside that carefully constructed world until even the smallest breath feels like an act of defiance. For a brief moment after Ridge's plea, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if the entire weight of what had happened was waiting for someone, anyone, to decide what kind of people they truly were. And in that suspended space, Electra realized something with a clarity that cut deeper than the pain she was already carrying. This was no longer just about what RJ had done to her, but about whether the truth would be allowed to exist at all. Ridge's words lingered, heavy and complicated, not because they were loud, but because of everything they implied. He had not denied the possibility of RJ's guilt, nor had he openly defended him. Yet his instinct had been to contain, to minimize, to protect. That instinct revealed more than any direct admission ever could. It exposed the invisible structure that had always existed within the family, a hierarchy where power, legacy, and blood quietly dictated the limits of accountability. And Electra, standing at the edge of that structure, understood that if she stepped back now, if she allowed this moment to be softened or buried, she would not only lose her voice but become complicit in her own erasure. Her decision did not come from a place of strength in the conventional sense. It came from something far more fragile and far more powerful. The refusal to let what had happened be rewritten into something smaller, something more convenient. When she spoke again, her voice carried a steadiness that surprised even her, not because the fear had disappeared, but because it no longer held the same authority over her. She did not argue with Ridge in anger, nor did she plead for understanding. Instead, she stood firm in a truth that could not be negotiated, and in doing so, she shifted the entire balance of the situation. That shift rippled outward, reaching every corner of the family and the company in ways no one could fully control. For Will, the consequences were immediate and unsettling. He had always believed he understood the game he was playing, that he could maneuver RJ into exposing his weaknesses without ever crossing a line himself. But what had happened shattered that illusion. This was no longer about strategy or rivalry. It was about something irrevocable, something that forced Will to confront his own role in pushing RJ toward the edge. The satisfaction he might have once felt at being proven right was replaced by a quiet, persistent unease, a realization that he had underestimated the darkness he was dealing with. Within Forster Creations, the atmosphere transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Conversations became cautious, glances more loaded, and every decision carried an undercurrent of tension that could not be ignored. People began to choose sides, though few would admit it openly. Some aligned themselves with the idea of protecting the family at all costs, clinging to the belief that the company's legacy was too important to be jeopardized by scandal. Others, more quietly but no less firmly, began to question whether that legacy had already been compromised by the very act of trying to shield it from the truth. And at the center of it all, RJ found himself in a reality he could no longer manipulate or escape. The anger that had once fueled him began to collapse under the weight of consequence, leaving behind something far more unsettling: the slow, creeping awareness of what he had done. It did not come all at once. There was resistance at first, an instinctive attempt to deflect, to justify, to cling to fragments of denial. But those defenses proved fragile in the face of Electra's unwavering stance and the growing distance of those around him. Each passing moment stripped away another layer of illusion, until he was left with nothing but the stark truth of his actions. Ridge's struggle became increasingly visible as the situation escalated. The dual roles he occupied, father and leader, pulled him in opposing directions, each demanding a different kind of response. There were moments when his instinct to protect RJ resurfaced with almost desperate urgency, moments where he searched for ways to mitigate the damage, to find some path that would allow his son to avoid complete ruin. But those moments were now countered by an equally powerful recognition that the cost of such protection would be too great, not just for Electra, but for the integrity of everything he claimed to represent. The tension reached a critical point when the possibility of legal action became unavoidable. What had once been an internal crisis, something that might have been managed behind closed doors, now threatened to move into a public arena where control would be significantly diminished. The implications of that shift were profound. It meant that the narrative would no longer be shaped solely by those within the family, that outside forces, law enforcement, media, public opinion, would begin to exert their own influence. And with that came a level of unpredictability that no amount of power or influence could fully contain. For Electra, the path forward remained difficult, but it was no longer defined by isolation. Her decision to speak had created space for others to acknowledge what had happened, even if that acknowledgement came slowly and imperfectly. There were those who offered support, quietly but sincerely, recognizing the courage it took to stand against a system that had every reason to resist her. That support did not erase the trauma, nor did it simplify the challenges ahead, but it provided something essential: the assurance that she was not alone in her refusal to accept silence. As the story continued to unfold, the fractures within the family became impossible to ignore. Relationships that had once seemed unshakable began to show signs of strain, tested by the conflicting loyalties and moral dilemmas that now defined their reality. Trust, once broken, did not simply return. It had to be rebuilt, if it could be rebuilt at all, and that process demanded a level of honesty and accountability that few were truly prepared to embrace. What remained undeniable, however, was that the events set in motion by RJ's actions had fundamentally altered the landscape of their world. The illusion of control, of stability, of unquestioned authority had been shattered. In its place stood a new, uncertain reality, one where the choices made in the aftermath would determine not just the fate of individuals, but the very identity of the family itself. And in that reality, the question was no longer whether the truth would come to light, but whether those who had the power to shape it would have the courage to face it fully, without